I'm a professor of history, but my day job is PVC for Research and Knowledge Exchange. It's really a great pleasure to have another of our sessions, which have been bouncing along through this academic year quite nicely. I'm going to pass to my colleague and longtime friend Panikos Panay, who's going to chair this session. Thanks as usual to Anna Maguire and Chris Zemba. These are our co-organizers of this migration seminar, and to Maeva and Anna, who do all the work behind the scenes to make these things work, and they do work well. So thank you all very much, and I won't welcome the speaker. Panikos is going to do that.
So thank you very much. So I'd like to welcome Siobhan, who's a graduate of the British Columbia University and also SOAS, and her research is focused on women, gender and Islam in South Asia, and she's received many grants, including from the Leverhulme Trust, the AHRC, and the British Academy. And she's the author of several books, including Elusive Lives, Gender Autobiography, and the Self in Muslim South Asia, and also something which I've found particularly interesting, which is Atiya's Journey, a Muslim woman from colonial Bombay to Edwardian Britain. So I'll hand over. Okay, you can go ahead.
I just need my slides to come up and then I will, there we go, perfect. That's wonderful. It's always strange in these circumstances, isn't it, when I can't actually see the audience, but I'm really grateful to all of you for joining today to hear this paper, and a big thank you to the organizers as well for welcoming me to speak today. The paper I'm going to give relates to it's a bit of a bridge paper, I suppose, between my previous project, which was focusing on the history of travel writing, and my newer work, which is focusing on food history in Muslim South Asia. So let me get started. And I'm going to start with a contemporary anecdote. 15-year-old Junaid Khan was traveling home from New Delhi to Haryana with his brother and two friends when he was stabbed to death on a train in June 2017. Around 200 people on the railway platform claim not to have seen the Muslim teenager die, but contemporary reports describe how an altercation over seats deteriorated into a quote-unquote mob attack on the four boys, vindicated on the basis that Muslims eat beef. Remembering Junaid after the attack, his friends recalled some of his favorite things: cricket, kite flying, bikes. His best friend Yassine also described his favorite food. While the rest of us ate mutton or chicken, he always wanted soya bean biryani. So every time he came home for Ramzan, his mother would cook him that, and those people taunted him and called him a beef eater. Now, many of you will know that this incident is just one of many that have hit the news under the ghastly label of beef lynchings since 2015. Very recently, we've also seen city administrations in Gujarat banning the sale of non-veg food by vendors on public roads. From it, I think we can see that what one eats, beef or not, has come to be constructed as one of the fundamental markers of difference between religious communities in Modi's India. In this communal discourse, the protagonists are undifferentiated and immutable. Hindus and Muslims have always been divided, and perhaps inevitably in conflict, because one worships the cow while the other eats it. As a challenge to this politicized narrative and the food fascism it underpins, this paper will explore how food has been employed as a marker of identity and difference among South Asian Muslims in the modern period. Muslims are too often portrayed as the bogeyman of contemporary Hindutva discourse, responsible for disturbing the Hindu status quo through their reprehensible eating practices. A focus on Muslim history thus inverts this representation, while also allowing an exploration of how the symbolic meanings attached to food can vary within a nation, community, or cultural grouping over time. Now, you're probably aware that anthropologists and sociologists have highlighted the many ways in which we, quote unquote, consume identity through food, emphasizing how what we eat or drink, and perhaps even more so what we do not, plays a key role in constructing and signifying who we are. As Arjun Appadurai observed in his seminal article on gastropolitics in Hindu South Asia, food can be used to mark and create relations of equality, intimacy, or solidarity, or instead to uphold relations signaling rank, distance, or segmentation. Food's function as a key cultural sign reinforcing a sense of self and other can become even more pronounced when different ethnic, regional, or religious groupings come into contact, either at home or abroad, a point that of course is of particular interest to this seminar with its focus on migration. For historians, a related interest has been to show how cuisines and gastronomy preserve a shared sense of community membership by maintaining historical continuities in terms of how everyday life is structured in its socio-cultural dimensions. Now, to access more quotidian experiences in this analysis of food identity and difference in Muslim South Asia, and again, fit in with this seminar's migration theme, the main sources that I'm going to be drawing on today are travel narratives. And I focus specifically on those written by women, some of whom you may see on the screen now, on the basis that historically, if not currently too, they tend to be more occupied with the preparation and serving of food. The sources that I'm going to be talking about today are drawn from right across the Indian subcontinent in a whole range of different languages, though primarily Urdu, and thus they enable a comparative and gendered approach to the mentalities underpinning food discourses. Now, as my pictures on the slide perhaps suggest, most of the authors that I'm going to be talking about fall into the category of elites in a region of low literacy, especially among women. But the cast of characters that they depict is actually far more varied in social terms. And I think this observation has special relevance to culinary reminiscences, being that food is most often grown, sold, cooked, served, and cleaned away by those projected as subaltern. Now, you may be wondering how many of these sources are actually available, how many travel writings there actually are by South Asian Muslim women. And the answer is probably more than you might expect. For a recent collaborative project on Muslim women's travel writing before the Jet Age, we found a sizable cache in Urdu, English, Persian, Punjabi, and Bengali. And these have provided the basis for the two main outputs from this project. One of the outputs is the book that you see on the left hand of the screen here, a book called 3 Centuries of Travel Writing by Muslim Women, which is soon to appear from Indiana University Press. I'm just going through the proofs for it, so I'll give it a quick plug now. The other main output is our digital archive, which you see on the right-hand side there, which is called Accessing Muslim Lives. And of course, this is freely available for browsing. So it's this kind of body of sources that I'm going to be drawing on for my paper, with plenty of thanks to my collaborators on this project as well, Daniel Makiewicz and Sunil Sharma, and many other contributors to the project as well. Just before I move on from this slide, I just wanted to note too that some of you may be interested as a kind of follow-up to today's talk to listen to a radio play that we put together based on some of these sources. You'll see that I've put the link that you can access it on YouTube on the slide. This was a play that was put together for the first South Asian Heritage Month Festival in 2020, mid-COVID, which is why it's in radio form. Now, reinforcing Barbara Metcalfe's representation of Hajj narratives as a modern phenomenon in South Asia, most of the travel writings that I'm going to talk about appeared after 1870, with a real proliferation in the 50 years between 1906 and 1956. So this is the period that I'm going to really focus on in order to kind of chart fluctuations, I suppose, from the high colonial period to the immediate post-colonial. Perhaps we're too that the departure points and international destinations varied very widely among these authors, with most leaving Muslim-led princely states or major conurbations, Bhopal or Hyderabad, Delhi, Bombay or Calcutta, for a variety of locations in the Middle East, Britain and continental Europe, or later the USA. So with this time scale and geographical spread, I think these travel writings can really reveal the ways in which food was used at different historical moments and locations to differentiate, not just between Hindus and Muslims, but also between colonizer and colonized, men and women, old nobilities, a new middle class and the poor, and Muslims of different regions and locales. Now, to make this argument, my paper is going to be divided into sort of 4 main sections today that very much reflect themes in my source material. And I thought for today's purpose, what I would do is kind of summarize my general findings in relation to each of those themes, but intersperse them with plenty of quotations from the source materials that I hope will kind of illustrate each theme in a way that will also give you flavor, forgive the food metaphors, of the style and content of these sources. I've also included lots of images today, all of which nearly, I think, are taken from our book, 3 Centuries of Travel Writing. So I have pictures of almost all of the authors, which I hope will kind of visualize these travelers. Some of them, the images are also from during their travels too. I might note too that I'm just kind of finishing up the final revisions on this paper for a special issue with global food history. So I do really welcome any comments and suggestions that you may have during the Q&A at the end. So the first theme I would like to take up is the way, the when and the where in which food was used in these travel narratives to draw a distinction between South Asians as a group, or Indians as it was expressed in an imperial context, and their colonial rulers. And this is going to be captured in my first section today, which you will see is entitled Sharing Poppadoms in Ohio. Now, of particular interest here, I think, is how this difference between colonizer and colonized was expressed, not just in terms of what food was eaten, but also how food was eaten. In other words, eating etiquette. And what we see, I think, is how these Muslim authors upturned certain civilizational hierarchies promulgated to justify empire through their often quite critical attitudes to British food and eating practices, especially. Now, exemplifying this trend in terms of her response to the food itself is the first author that I'd like to introduce you to today. And this is a woman called Begum Inan Habibullah. She was from a talakdari, or landlord background in the United Provinces, and she visited Britain with her husband and young daughter in 1924 to meet her 3 sons at boarding school in Dorset. And you actually see all of these figures that I've just mentioned in her family in this photo, which is on the slide here, which was actually taken during their visit in 1924. Now, we see that her experience of eating out in London occasioned the following quite brutal assessment of English cuisine. And the food, I think, can't but taste bad to a Hindustani. I can make this conjecture, for when I was in India, I was accustomed to eating English food regularly. But to be honest, since coming here, I've grown to detest it. Her allusion to English food in India points to the regularity with which Indian Muslims of a particular status and association with the colonial regime enjoyed European dishes by the early 20th century, to the point that the era's Urdu cookbooks, which I'm also working on, often included a section on Angrezi dishes or were dedicated to them entirely. The omnipresent roast meat and boiled vegetables, described contemptuously by her as puna gosht and ubli hui sabzi, soon became tiresome, however. Particularly offensive to Begum Habibullah was the way in which meat was prepared in England. As she explained with obvious disdain, most of the time the food here is only nominally put before a flame. You'll often cut into a piece of meat and watch the blood ooze out. People here declare it juicy and gobble it up. I think the fact that meat was being used by this Indian Muslim woman to differentiate colonizer from colonized already starts kind of muddling contemporary representations of a strictly Hindu-Muslim divide. Notably, it wasn't just the style of cooking in England that Begum Habibullah disliked, but also the context of eating it, namely in a restaurant where she was very discomfited by all the other diners staring openly at the Hindustani party. And I think this suggests how kind of eating out as a bourgeois performance, by which diners were gallery audience to strangers at the next table, had merged in this period with colonial spectacle in a way very unconducive to Muslim norms of modesty. Restaurant culture was in fact critiqued by a number of Muslim female travelers to Britain in the late colonial era. Perhaps the most comprehensive reflection came from my next author, who you see here on my slide, was a woman called Nazli Begum. She visited a few years earlier, actually, in 1908, on a royal tour with her husband, who was the Nawab of Janjira, a small princely state in West India. And again, on my slide here, you actually have a picture of this couple that was taken by a studio during their visit. She noted of a day out in London with a certain air of fatigue, I think. After strolling about, it was lunchtime and we ate somewhere. At tea time, we had tea somewhere. Sometimes I like this practice, but at other times it irks me. How can one enjoy eating and drinking and doing everything in public? In England, there is an indiscriminate increase in eating out at hotels and such establishments. And she goes on from there. But I think this passage really shows this kind of undercurrent of disapproval in the way that the British ate at home as opposed to the Indian colonies. And what's kind of clear as the 20th century moves on is that this kind of cultural critique becomes the basis for a more kind of explicitly nationalist expression heading towards Indian independence in 1947. Now, a balance to this cultural dissatisfaction was the solace taken by those traveling or living abroad in familiar desi foods. And I think this really points to how kind of culinary longing contributed to the construction of an explicitly Indian identity amongst these South Asian travelers in the late colonial period. We might consider as example the author and educationalist Attia Faizi, who was sister of the aforementioned Nazi Begum of Janjira, who wrote over and over in her London diary about the joy of meeting friends from Bombay and elsewhere, whether Muslim, Hindu or Parsi, to share delicious Indian food, Laziz Hindi Khana. Imagine, she wrote to her family and community of readers at home in India, how dal, chutney, etc. would taste after eating bland food for so many days. We Indians have such a craving for this kind of food. And I think we can see here how a now tacit, if not always appropriate, distinction between the bland British palate and a spicy Indian cuisine was fueled these kind of subcontinental identities that were being effectively lived out from meal to meal. Of course, creating Indian dishes abroad could prove difficult in early 20th century Britain. Unable to find besan or chickpea flour to make pulkis for her husband's iftar meal during the Ramzan fast. Another author, Mohammadi Begum, who you see here in Oxford in the mid-1930s with her husband and baby son, she fell back on using peas meal, a roasted yellow pea flour that was mostly used for Scottish brose and bannock. On another occasion, she hosted a fellow Oxford student for a meal of pulao, kebab, and kheer. In Mohammadi's assessment, the almond kheer was no good, just almonds, milk, and sugar. Presumably because none of the spices, potentially saffron and cardamom, or other nuts for topping like cashews and pistachios were easily available to her. Now, as my title for this section probably suggested, food didn't just draw together Indians of different denominations and social groups in Britain in the late colonial period. Even after India was granted independence in 1947, with the creation of two new nation states often at war, food was still used to distinguish South Asians as a group from Westerners in particular. A revealing example here, I think, is a travelogue that was written by a young woman from Hyderabad, Nissa, who journeyed to Canton, Ohio in 1953 to undertake a nursing course while her husband gained experience as a urologist in a nearby hospital. Of course, in the image that you have of her here, you see her in her nursing uniform, and indeed the caption describes her as Nissa, nurse. She wrote on repeat about taking poppadom and mango chutney, to reference my section's title, whenever there may be a gathering of what she called Indians. But when she uses this term, it's clear that they may be Muslim, Hindu, or otherwise. They may even be Indian or Pakistani, but they were all Indians to her in the United States. As she recounted after one such enjoyable evening shared with fellow medical practitioners, everyone liked the poppadoms we had brought, and the Indian doctors smacked their lips when I fed them my tasty mango pickle, as if we could eat home cooking from our native land and not be left licking our fingers. It was worth seeing the state those gentlemen were in at that moment. We kept on eating chicken curry and such like. Here in America, Indians had found a taste that warmed their souls, and memories of home had started filling their hearts until they were beside themselves. Otherwise, what was so special about poppadoms and mango pickle? I think this passage really sums up how food, with its kind of deep-seated physicality and entrenched association with home, could inspire this kind of unified South Asian or Desi identity in opposition to a colonial or post-colonial other. Now, at the same time, I think we can see that the culinary distinctions between British colonizer and Indian colonized, Westerner and Desi, were sometimes expressed in these Muslim writings, not so much in cultural terms, but in religious terms. And that really brings me to my next section, which you'll see is entitled No Ham in Hamburgers. Now, I'll come to the context for this wonderful quote in a moment. But the first thing I wanted to highlight, I guess, is how these religious distinctions were often expressed through a dialogue around halal food in particular. Among the travelogues that underpin this article's analysis are a set of Hajj narratives, a distinguishing feature of which is their account of just how much food was carried by pilgrims on their journey. One female Haji, Rahil Begum Shavania, who is the only one I don't have an image for you of, unfortunately, recalled in her travelogue, which was penned in 1923 but published in 1929, how she was quizzed by her fellow female passengers on the extent of the cooking supplies and food stores that she brought with her. When she admitted to little of the former and none of the latter, there was real agitation among her fellow travelers. One spoke up, "But we alone have 4 canisters of ghee or clarified butter with us, plus 2 sacks of wheat flour, a sack of rice, a sack of dal, spices and seasonings, and so on." Now, the reason for Indian travelers carrying so many goods then as now may have been pecuniary, or it may have been a matter of taste. But in women's own narratives, it was often justified on religious ground. And that's the point I really want to highlight in this section. For Muslim travelers in the interwar period, a real concern seemed to be that the food provided may not be halal or permissible according to Islamic law, especially if one was traveling on a British or continental European ship. And there's many examples in surviving travel writings of how these fears of contravening food prohibitions accentuated different divisions between Muslim passengers and a European crew. Rahil Begum, for instance, recounted how another female first-class passenger made every effort to discourage her from taking meals provided by the ship on the basis that I might, God forbid, be eating non-halal meat. Also very notable in these travel narratives was a conspicuous dialogue on meat, which I think really underscores the importance of this foodstuff to authors' constructions of a definably Muslim identity. Best exemplifying this trend, though certainly not exclusively, were the travel writings of Nishido Nissa Begum, better known as Begum Hasrat Mohani on account of her marriage to a prominent anti-colonial activist. On Hajj with her husband for the 3rd successive year in 1935-36, she wrote a long letter from Baghdad to their daughter in India, in which she described the different ingredients available in the local markets. And you can see this described here on the slide. But we can see there's a particular wonder, I think, that comes out when she gets to the meat products. There are liver kebabs and more. There's also lots of beef available, and buffalo too. There's also meat from sheep and goats, both of which are expensive nowadays. Fat can be easily had for 8 annas a seah. Her attentiveness here to the availability and affordability of meat, I think, really sets this Muslim author apart from an imagined Hindu other at home in India. And I think this suggests that the obtainability of beef especially must have really brought clarity to her of being a Muslim in a Muslim country, particularly after cow protection movements had swept across North and Central India from the 1870s to accentuate beef eating as taboo, if not illicit. What I think is quite curious, however, is that for those women traveling in Europe or the United States, as opposed to the Middle East, in roughly the same high colonial period, meat eating was not actually equated with Muslims at all, but most often Europeans and Americans. I noted already in the previous section how Begum Inam Habibullah, visiting Britain in the early 1920s, was highly critical of the local cuisine, on account of the prevalence of, in her view, undercooked meat. An analogous complaint came from Attia Faizi on board the P&O ship Moldavia that took her from Bombay to Marseille en route to London a few years earlier in September 1906. Just a few days into the journey, she proclaimed, "I'm fed up with this menu," on the basis that it had a dearth of vegetables. As she explained, "Since I'm not fond of meat and there are no vegetables cooked there, it is truly difficult for me. If only I'd brought some achar, pickle with me, then it would have been enjoyable." I think these type of responses point to meat eating as a kind of gendered historical practice associated with ideals of masculinity in many parts of India, with women, including in Muslim communities, less likely in the early 20th century, as now, to consume meat as regularly. Interestingly, the historical location most often equated with meat as a cheap and plentiful foodstuff by these Muslim female travelers was the post-war United States. Pioneering Pakistani journalist, I'm just waiting for my slide to move on. I hope. Doesn't want to go. Hopefully it will in a second.
We can see it from this side.
Oh, I've gone too far now. It must have been there we go. Yes, pioneering Pakistani journalist Zebunissa Hamidullah offers a case in point. In the early 1950s, she spent 2 months traveling coast to coast by car with her husband as part of a foreign leader exchange program hosted by the US Department of State. Her quotidian account, firstly in a weekly column in the Times of Karachi and later a book, was saturated with food memories, from informal meals in American homes to supermarket shopping and roadside diners. Capturing Begum Hamidullah's imagination early on was the quintessential 50s experience of visiting a drive-in restaurant. Having explained the unique arrangements of ordering, eating, and paying without once even getting out of the car, she turned enthusiastically to the food. "I had a hamburger and how delicious it was." Attentive to the food injunctions of her Pakistani audience, she quickly followed up with an explanation that prompted this section's title. Now, a hamburger, in case you're feeling suspicious, is a piece of beef between 2 pieces of bun with a lot of tomato sauce and pickle sprinkled on it. Without any actual reference to the forbidden pork, she of course pronounced her Muslim identity. Now, the third theme I wanted to draw out was how food was used to distinguish not just Muslims from non-Muslims, but also Indian Muslims from other Muslims, in a form of what Apadadurai calls segmentation. And this is going to be captured in my third section, which you probably saw the slide of a minute ago, which is called, I think quite evocatively, That Stinking Muslim Key. Now, the title probably suggests that what was unanticipated here was the way in which this forging of a Muslim other through food seemed to happen primarily when Indian Muslims traveled on Hajj or other forms of pilgrimage to the Middle East. In both contemporary and historical experience, this type of travel is usually identified with a heightened sense of Muslim unity. In other words, with pilgrims being kind of enveloped by a strong sense of belonging to the Ummah or a universal Muslim community. Complicating this perception, however, are the many accounts of food in these writings, which actually show how food becomes a point of division among pilgrims. An early and rather extreme example may be found in Nawab Sikandar Begum's Hajj account, which was written in 1863 to 64 and only published in 1870. Among the innumerable cultural practices that this royal author found objectionable in 1860s Arabia were the cooking and eating arrangements, or as she saw it, the absence of them. First of all, there was the household layout. Because the kitchen, water storage, bedroom, sitting room, and toilet were all connected to one another, when relaxing or sleeping, one was constantly annoyed by kitchen smoke, and for that matter, bathroom odors. Then there was the desert inhabitants or Bedouins, who in Sikandar's estimation did not know how to cook at all, favoring honey, dates, and ghee instead. As she put it with customary bluntness, they eat their meals raw and are unable to discern good taste from bad. It is perhaps no wonder that as her trip progressed, disagreements with the Sharif of Mecca over eating protocols became so heated that they had to put in place a special intermediary who was employed to actually stop threats to her life. The food in hotels, or lack of it, proved another matter of complaint for Indian Muslims visiting different Middle Eastern locations in the early 20th century. And I think a really nice example comes from the writing of Begum Sarbalanjung, who traveled to Damascus around 1909 with her husband, who was then the Chief Justice of Hyderabad. This couple were very much kind of inspired by a pan-Islamic ideal that sought to underplay ethnic or regional differences between Muslims, and hence they were drawn to an Arab hotel by its sweet name, Medina Munawwara, or Radiant Medina. Sadly, being owned by people of the faith did not stop it being filthy in her description. And to top it all off, the food was terrible, and tea and coffee were not available either, a real disaster. And I think this really points to how dirty accommodation and poor sustenance kind of converged in these old constructions of the Orient. Now, if the culinary gaps between Indian and Arab Muslims have perhaps only been implicit in the passages so far, they emerged far more sharply in Rahil Begum Shavania's pilgrimage narrative from the early 1920s, to which I've referred already. Of particular note here are those passages in which food was used to distinguish between the Indian Muslims aboard a Hajj ship and the Meccan Muslims they were going to visit, the latter of whom, of course, occupied the holiest site of Islam, and yet in a kind of reversal of historic notions of center and periphery within the Islamic world, were not considered superior or even equal to their South Asian co-religionists. I think the following exchange between Rahil Begum and a fellow female passenger, inspiring this section's title, is worth quoting at length for the kind of intensity of sentiment. I asked her what sort of disaster she was expecting that she would bring so many supplies with her. She replied, "Sister, we wouldn't be able to bear eating Mecca Sharif's stinking ghee for a single day. We'd rather eat boiled food than their ghee. Even if we have to go without food for 4 days, we won't put that ghee in our mouths." To which I replied, "Well, then you yourself should take my people a canister of ghee. I will eat that sticky, rotten ghee instead." She said, "The wheat there is so bad that it clogs up your intestines," and proceeded to trash every single grain in Mecca Sharif. There were about 12 women there, each of whom took a turn to sing the highest praises of the items they had brought with them, and to try and scare me by impressing upon me my impending suffering. We see that Rahil Begum herself, from a prominent and accomplished family associated with Islamic modernism, did not place herself above eating the rotten victuals of the Arab other, but in doing so, she was clearly in the minority. Still, she recognized the kind of mutuality of Muslim othering. As she noted of an Arab family, also aboard her ship, identified only as traders from Bahrain, "I can't claim to know if they have brought many foodstuffs with them, since they seem to have some type of disgust for Indians. I pass in front of their cabins often enough, but aside from finding that they are avid eaters, I haven't been able to learn much else about them." Now, as the final line here, I think, indicates, a division was made between Indian and Arab Muslims, not only in terms of the quality of food consumed, but also in terms of the amount. South Asian Muslim society had seen a reworking of understandings of status in the 19th century as a new middle class encompassed those benefiting from colonial education and economy. In the circumstances of British rule, frugality and prudence came to be celebrated as defining features of elite or Sharif standing. Reflecting this historical shift, Arab overconsumption was singled out by many colonial Indian travelers as a kind of affront to the cultural values underpinning their privilege. As Rahil Begum continued with her description of the Bahraini traders, "Every day they slaughter a sheep, and mashallah, every day they eat the whole thing. I do not exaggerate when I tell you that they have 2 cooks who prepare food 24 hours a day, and mashallah, they use the largest cooking vessels imaginable. they've definitely outdone the Indians. Nawab Sikandar Begum, who again we've met already, reworked Orientalist tropes to join the refrain too. She wrote, "The people of Arabia take a great quantity of food, as much as 5 or 6 pounds in weight in the course of a day, but the diet is very gross and their eating habits are dirty." And I think we can see here how this princely ruler in particular was seeking to kind of, I guess, resuscitate the reputation of her class in the face of colonial and Muslim discourses that equated the old nobility with decadence and a new elite with cleanliness and restraint. Now, this leads me on to a kind of fourth and final theme, which is the way in which, in similar contexts and circumstances to those that I've just been discussing, food was also used to distinguish Muslims from different status groups and regions within India from each other. In short, I think we see how food was kind of as important to underpinning differences of social status among South Asian Muslims as it was to an ethnic in other contexts. And this is captured in my fourth section, which is called Spitting Pan into the Wind. Now,
You've frozen. I'm not sure what we're doing here.
I think Siobhan may have lost her connection. So please bear with us while we get Siobhan back online, everyone.
Right, I'll turn my mic off.
So I'm not quite sure where I was, but I think I was just starting my fourth section.
You're on slide
slide
22.
So, yeah, slide 22.
Okay. And
Section
here, forgive me if I've said this bit already, but this is like the introduction to this section. And here I just wanted to emphasize how food was used to distinguish Muslims from different status groups and regions within India from each other. So looking at how food could underpin differences in social status among South Asian Muslims, just as much as it did national, communal, and ethnic identities. Now, reflecting the redefinition of Sharif or noble status among Indian Muslims from the late 19th century, a separation was most often made between old and new nobility as defined by birth in contrast to good character, though also between an Ashraf elite and their Ajlaf opposite. Now, I've pointed already to how Rahil Begum Shrivania belonged to a family lauded for its association with Aligarh reformism, sought to distinguish her modernist ways from those of an old nobility. Hence her passage on Mecca's stinking ghee, which I've just quoted in the previous section, concluded with an oblique reference to the disparities between her, the narrator, and the women about whom she was writing, the narrated. And I think her satirical style is really evident in how she captured their exchange. "You are elegant and refined women from the city of Delhi. So how can a village person like me, who is accustomed to eating whatever comes to hand, possibly be the equal to you?" One particularly boastful woman replied, "It's true, sister. We'd sooner go hungry than eat badly." She went on to explain that others aboard ship surpassed even this group in terms of the volume and variety of their food stalls, with many bringing sheep, goats, and baskets full of chickens to be slaughtered on the deck each morning. Worst of all, according to Rahil Begum, were the large baskets of pan, some containing as many as 5,000 or 6,000 leaves each, their size according to the status of their owner. And that's her quote. Her spirited account highlights how food's abundance, the ability to travel with half a farmyard and a crop of pan, operated as a status symbol, or in Apadarized words, a sign of rank for these South Asian Muslim travelers. At the same time, we see how Rahil Begum sought to distinguish herself as a new Sharif woman from the other elites with whom she traveled in first-class accommodation. there was a kind of false modesty in portraying herself as a village person in comparison with these elegant and refined Delhi types is clear when she's writing about them rather than narrating what she said to them. Then they don't appear refined and elegant at all, but quite the opposite. This distinction is perhaps most clear in another passage on Pan, captured for this section's title. And then there are our respected sisters who chew pan and spit its juices out. Oftentimes they spit against the wind, such that the juice is carried back into the room in 1,000 different drops. Sometimes it lands on the face of a European, sometimes it ruins another's clothes. Alas, I am compelled to write that these ignorant pilgrims are more suited to rickety cargo ships, where horses and goats are given the same treatment, and where they would be so thrown about that they wouldn't be able to raise their heads. In the course of a few lines, our respected sisters, who we may fairly conjecture belonged not to the new Sharif but the old, were transformed into ignorant pilgrims. For their gross eating habits, gross in terms of extravagance and gross in terms of bad manners, they were put in their place in an evolving social hierarchy. Interestingly, these travel accounts also made a dietary distinction between elites and those deemed below them in the social hierarchy, in other words, between the Ashraf and the Ajlaf. We may consider here Rahil Begum's description of the arrangements made for her own staff while aboard the Hajj ship from Bombay to Jeddah in 1923. Unwilling for her servants to eat from the ship's meals for the poor, she paid an additional rupee per person per day for proper arrangements. Subsequently, her servants were given not the food that she and her family ate themselves from the ship's kitchen, much to the consternation of her neighbor, who, as I've noted already, feared it was not halal, but the meals that the ship's cooks prepared for themselves. Now, Rahil Begum may have been keen to perform the benevolent employer when it came to feeding her own servants, but what is equally interesting is that she remained scathing of other poor passengers, whom she depicted as aggressive, dishonest, and all-around ill-natured. I think it's quite notable that even as Rahil Begum's ruminations on food and water revealed and reinforced socioeconomic identities among South Asian Muslims, survey uncovered regional differentiations too. Garnering the most virulent response were those that had the most different food cultures, namely those from Bihar and Bengal, as we see in this quote. Oh, it's on the next slide, sorry. As she wrote of those from Bihar and Bengal, may God never ask us to travel with them again. The importance of food to regional identity construction among South Asian Muslims in the interwar period emerged most strongly in another pilgrimage account written by Lahori educator and journalist Fatima Begum, who you see here on my slide. I think it's quite noteworthy that she was a educator and journalist, but she was later to surface as a principal activist in the Pakistan movement. During her 1934 Hajj, she was involved in a shipwide commotion, partially over that foodstuff already established as contentious, namely ghee. In her published diary, she began by explaining how she was approached by several gentlemen to sign a petition that would carry their threefold complaints to the ship's captain. 1, the contractor doesn't give hot water for tea and he demands 2 pesos per kettle of water. In the food we receive, vegetable oil is used instead of ghee, which makes us and our children sick. And 3, the food is neither good nor abundant. This should be remedied. Fatima Begum must have been sympathetic to these grievances because, according to her own account, she went on to intervene on behalf of the other passengers with the contractors. But I think what's especially interesting in her account are the subsequent reflections on this disagreement, which really underscore how regional tastes coalesced as kind of markers of difference, especially as more Indians traveled together on cheaper and faster continental and intercontinental transportation from the late 19th century. As she wrote, I don't understand why people aboard this Hajj ship constantly fight about food, even though the food isn't so bad. Bengalis, Madrasis, people from UP, Punjabis, Sindhis, frontiers people, Bukharis, they can't all enjoy the same kind of food. Now, because of my interruption, I've probably gone on too long, but I hope you will indulge me some time for a conclusion. And here I would like to return to an author oft quoted in this essay, thanks to the engaging, astute, and I think often acerbic quality of her narrative, namely Raheel Begum Shavania. An ellipsis in the passage I've already quoted on Mecca's stinking key hides how this author used dialogue with other female Hajis to point to a key observation about food, identity, and difference. Faced with the other women's intransigence, Raheel Begum asked, "Why? Aren't the residents of Mecca human too?" The answer was definitive. Human or not, everyone has their own habits and tastes. Now you'll know that I've captured this one sentence for my paper's title today, and I've chosen it because I think it points to food's most basic quality. In short, we all need food to live, and so it should really underscore our shared humanity. And yet, despite this, or perhaps more rightly because of it, food becomes a main mode by which we articulate our identity, both as individuals and social groups. Hence, a quote of a French gastronome appears so regularly: "Tell me what you eat and I'll tell you who you are." Food preparation, consumption, etiquette combine to construct and communicate belonging to a social group, affirmed as different to other groups, defined by class, kinship, nation, ethnicity, and/or religion in a kind of rank order. Now, I've tried to apply these sociological insights in this paper to show how South Asian Muslims used food in the colonial period and just after to construct notions of self and other, with travel narratives by women able to capture those moments when these distinctions came into the sharpest relief. The historian's offering is to highlight how concepts of identity and difference shifted by time as well as place. In the imperial metropole at the height of empire, what and how food was eaten set colonized Indian apart from colonizing British, reinforcing a Desi identity that persisted into post-colonial context. Meat consumption, on the other hand, could activate religious discourses around halal food that reinforced Muslim sensibilities, even as these were moderated by gender and destination. Eating practices could also disrupt identification with a global Muslim community at those very moments when one might expect it to be strongest, on Hajj or when pan-Islamism was heightened. In those specifically Muslim contexts, the quality and amount of food consumed by individuals or groups, along with the cleanliness of the environment in which it was prepared, worked to fracture the ummah by nationality, social status, and region. A threefold division between old nobilities, a new middle class, and the poor, emerging in South Asian Muslim society from the 19th century, coalesced around these symbolic meanings attached to food. Now, thinkers associated with structuralism and post-structuralism have highlighted the way in which humans understand the world in relational terms, using dichotomous oppositions with shifting meanings to decode the world around them. In colonial and post-colonial contexts, these oppositions are interpreted to feed into a discourse of difference or othering, us, them, civilized, savage, rational, superstitious, advanced, backwards, etc., etc. That South Asian Muslims engaged with these Orientalist constructs as they traveled the world in the late 19th and 20th century is self-evident from their writing. Their accounts of different food cultures, practices, and experiences, however, indicate that they often reinterpreted or reapplied these binaries. Far from internalizing a sense of native inferiority in Fanon's terms, these authors used food to assert the value of their own cultural and religious practices against those conceptualized as superior, the British colonizer, Arab Muslims, those of noble birth. In doing so, they reworked established hierarchies of race, religion, and class, offering alternative constructions of the West and the Orient alike. Now, I think just a very final point to make is that these historical conclusions have really important implications for how communal differences linked to food are constructed in India today, with all their bloody consequences. Far from fixed or fundamental, the Hindu-Muslim divide over the holy cow has been one of many culinary markers of identity and difference for South Asian Muslims in the modern period, not inconsequential, but also not exclusive. Just as past binaries reflected and illuminated a historical moment, so this one does our own, as a time when a politicized narrative around cow protection authorizes and emboldens violence against India's Muslim minority. Yet, even in the age of Hindutva, resistance can still find expression through food cultures. And this is very much the point of my current project, which is a project entitled Forgotten Food, where we're trying to kind of, or seeking anyway, to mediate difference between religious groups by fostering an awareness of historic recipes linked to Muslim culinary heritage in India. And you'll see, again, I've just sort of pointed you maybe to some further reading on the slide, which is a collection of food writing that comes out of this current project. The book, when it was published in India, was Desi Delicacies. It's been published here as Dastakhan, and it's edited by my co-investigator, Claire Chambers. You might also be interested in looking at the column that Claire and I edit for Scroll, and there's just some examples of the articles in that on the screen. Altogether, I think this points to the fact that food's significance to politics and the structuring of everyday life is not just a story of historical continuities or rigid boundaries, but also one of fluidity, rupture, and change. And that brings me to the end. Thank you.
Thanks very much. That was really brilliant, and I found it. And please send me a copy of your article when it's published.
Thank you.
And I mean, I found it in. Sorry, I'm going to take chair's privilege here, and maybe do a little bit of a, critique and ask some questions. It was.
Can we just take the slides off so I can see you?
Yeah.
There we go. Perfect.
I mean, I was glad you brought in Jonathan Savaron at the end, because I was going to ask you if you'd read him, and I guess what he said. I mean, what you were doing, I guess, was pointing out that food and identity operates almost on an individual level because of the way you were breaking it up. But one of the, I mean, I did a bit of work on South Asian food in Britain, and one of the there's two things that happen amongst South Asians in Britain who are long settlers, and one is that they give up their religious food eating practices in the short run, so turning to vegetarianism, or in some cases just eating meat and ignoring the culinary restrictions. And I remember in one case when I was studying Indian food or Asian food in Leicester, an interviewee said that they cut the chicken's head and just said a prayer while doing this, and that made it halal. So so I wondered if any of your I wonder if any of your writers actually had to abandon their Muslim practices. And then the other thing which I found was that, and I guess this doesn't work for your writers because they're travel writers, was that in the long run there's an adaptation of English eating in the construction of English type foods with an Asian spicing, for example. I mean, one I remember is Indian spiced baked beans. But I mean, I guess that's something which can only happen. Well, I don't know. Is that something which can only happen for long settled communities? So,
yeah. Thank you for those questions, Panicos. Obviously, probably in difference to many of the papers maybe in this series, I'm focusing on travel as opposed to migration, and I appreciate that those are somewhat different things. At the same time, many of the authors that I'm talking about here did spend fairly lengthy periods in the places that they traveled to. So one section of our book focuses particularly on those who travel for education, and that might involve being in Britain for 3 or 4 or 5 or even more years. So maybe I can kind of think of them as I answer your question today. I mean, one thing that I think comes out from just in regard to your first question about kind of giving up on food practices is that certainly amongst some of the authors I've been talking about here, they they're sort of aware that they kind of have to kind of make do in some ways. So there's kind of a feeling that, you know, particularly with Rahil Begum Shavania, for instance, that, you know, her attitude to whether it's halal or not is that if someone tells her halal, they accept that, and you know, just accept that that's the way it is. So, you know, I think there's a sort of realism amongst them in a way. And particularly in the kind of British context, you know, you see some of the more devout perhaps giving up on meat eating because they can't guarantee that the meat is halal, so they would rather just eat vegetables. But on the most hand, there's kind of a bit of flexibility, I suppose, in terms of kind of how they address these Muslim practices. In terms of long-term adaptation, my impression actually amongst those who sort of seem to stay longer is actually they become more attached actually to kind of food as a means of connecting them with home. And, you know, particularly, I mean, this isn't so much amongst female authors, but amongst some of the male travel authors, they talk about how when they kind of arrive in Britain, and, you know, many of them are quite young, they're only like in their 20s or whatever, you know, they're quite keen to try all the kind of local food and this, that, and the other. But as time goes on, they increasingly sort of search it out. And that, you know, I think that's sort of a trend actually that crosses many of them, is this how food becomes that one thing that can connect, that can you know, bring you back, and a lot of effort is put into kind of you know, searching out spices, searching out restaurants, and there's become certain restaurants in London, Shafi's for instance, which you're probably familiar with from your own work on London, which become these kind of hangouts where all of these Muslims, well, Indian students more generally, kind of meet so that they can sort of share a meal, and then those become real centres for nationalist politics and the like as well. So yeah, I think food has this certain yeah, kind of value in that way to these travellers.
So thank you very much. We've got some questions from Mohammed Riaz Chenganaka. I don't know if you want to read, if you want to raise your hand and ask directly, or if Siobhan wants to.
Let's see, I'm just finding them here on the list, yeah. The first question he asks is about thinking about this as gastronomic multiculturalism. If you're free, if you're able to speak, Mohammed, would you mind just kind of developing what you're referring to here?
I think Mohammed might be having problems hearing, so what we can do is I'll text now, and we'll send him your responses in the video, in the recording.
Okay. Okay. Well, maybe I'm not quite sure what he means by that, so maybe I'll just move on to some of the other ones here. The next one is about the debates around animal and cow sacrifice in the period, and obviously these are really highly charged, you know, political debates that are going on at the period. Obviously, I see them in lots of other sources that I've worked on in this period, particularly in kind of socio-religious reform literature and those kind of things. But I think I'm only reading them implicitly, I suppose, into these sources. They're not referred to explicitly. In fact, there's no explicit reference to dietary differences between Hindus and Muslims, which I think is interesting in itself, and rather, you know, anything around kind of cow protection or indeed around kind of temperance movements as well. It doesn't find a place in these particular travel narratives. Yes, the third question he asks here is about the presence of food, and how do these travel writers talk about the hunger absence of food, especially how the poor pilgrims beg for food in Mecca. And definitely there is a lot of reflection in some of these narratives on kind of poor pilgrims, but usually in quite not a very accepting way, quite a derogatory way, actually, kind of looking down again. Food or the absence of it becomes a way of kind of distinguishing one's own social status. So at a moment where you might expect, again, people to be sort of charitable, quite the opposite. I think people are kind of sort of dismissive, and seeing some of these pilgrims who are begging as a problem, rather than kind of alerting any charitable impulse. Thank you for those questions, Mohammed. I'm sorry I wasn't able to fully answer the first one.
Thank you. I don't know if we've... has Chris got a question?
Chris, did you want to ask your question in person?
Oh, yes, I'll ask my question in person. And thank you so much for such a fascinating presentation, which makes me wonder if the issue of food will cease to be an integral part of politics. I don't know, to be honest. I think it's going to be there forever. But my question is linked to the writers. Did they ever mention or make any reference to the medicinal value of the foods they are taking, or the diet, or they don't do that? Something I'm very fascinated about, that medicinal health value to this, and try to promote it from that perspective.
Yeah, absolutely, Chris. Many of these authors are engaging particularly with indigenous forms of medicine, Unani medicine particularly, which is a humoral system which really kind of emphasizes the impact of eating different kinds of foods on the humors of the body and on one's good health. So absolutely, the kind of eating the right kind of food becomes really important, and particularly so because many of these authors became very ill when they traveled, as many travelers do, of course. And so there's a lot in these writings about illness and physical illness, but also I think what we would interpret now as kind of mental illness. So the kind of intersection between medicine and food, becomes a real theme here, and particularly I think for authors coming to Britain, actually, because they reflect quite consciously about how the British food, many of them describe the British food as making them ill. So it's not just
I can relate to that as well. I'm not saying I'm right, but I can relate to that.
Yeah, so there's this kind of reflection that we saw. I mean, I actually cut that bit out of the presentation to get it across today, but there's this kind of reflection that it's not just unappetizing, it actually is so bad that it makes you sick. So one kind of has to fall back on kind of thinking about what foods will kind of balance out one's humors again and make one well again. And so yeah, that is really very much a theme in these writings.
Okay, thank you, Simon. Thank you very much.
We have another question from Riaz.
It went up and down again. I don't know if there was a question or not.
Yeah, can I ask?
Oh yes, please do.
Yeah. So I was thinking in terms of, like I'm working on Hajj narratives, right? So what I see at the end of Hajj narratives, you see this, this sort of, the whole discussion about the Mina and the animal sacrifice, right? So, and there is another package of food philanthropy happening. So looking at the, Malabar Hajj narratives, or from South India, I see there is a lot of food philanthropy things are happening. And then how it's not, what I think is that it's not just the women narrate the experience of food. I mean, in the male narratives too, what I see is that there is a kind of a particular gaze, towards how, women are
Mhm.
engaging with, especially from my context, the Malabar pilgrims are not part of the cooking, practice. Like when they go for pilgrimage, because they are very shy, they can't even get out, of their bed because they are very sick. But comparing them with Bengalis, with other pilgrims, we see that kind of active, in activity, the active presence of women for cooking and all. So what my question was, like, how do you understand this food philanthropy? Like for pilgrims, they just need rice with water, like some pilgrims, right? So this is a kind of we call it in Malayalam kanji. Kanji is a
Mhm.
porridge. So like
Yeah.
throughout the journey, they just need that that food that will give them that will sustain their health, that will give them
Mhm.
energy to do all the for pilgrimage performances. So what I meant is a kind of gastronomic multiculturalism. I heard a bit of your in a
Mhm.
response. So like, so we understand these as differences, like you know or part of making of the identity. So can we not consider as part of like all food habits are coming together into a pilgrimage? You
Mhm.
know that sort of understanding, or we can understand it with, like I have been thinking about the culinary cosmopolitanism. Like you think about the last rite of pilgrimage, right? The earlier
Mhm.
accounts, you have these all the cooking practices, and then this eating together, this collective habit of eating together, and even they understand. I mean, I'm not talking from the gender perspective, but the famous example of Malcolm X's narrative about eating together, right?
Mhm.
That's short shows that kind of a kind of culinary cosmopolitanic outlook is there in these
Mm.
narratives. I'm just thinking about it. I don't know how feasible that idea is. Yeah.
Yeah, I
Thank
think
you.
that's really fascinating, Riaz, and I think that's what I was trying to get at is that I think that's what you might expect to find in these narratives is that kind of sense of cosmopolitanism that and I think there's lots kind of written about the Hajj, isn't there, as this kind of time when everybody comes together and they go through the same rites, and they're it would be a good moment for food philanthropy, as you suggest. I think what therefore sort of surprised me initially, which I wanted to draw out in these narratives, is how that kind of collectivity that you point to um, actually doesn't seem to be there in the way that you might expect it. So there's kind of, in some of the narratives, the Hajj narratives that we've looked at for the project, there's a lot of rhetoric around that collectivity and that cosmopolitanism, and there's kind of these observations that oh, look at us all of us Muslims coming together and going through these same rites as all generations before us, and all of these kinds of things, and as you say, the kind of focus on the animal sacrifice and all of those things. But actually, when you get down to these kind of day-to-day narratives where people are kind of recording what actually happens as opposed to kind of the rhetoric of what they observe, then there's these very fine distinctions being made, and I mean, I was thinking too, there's in Fatima Begum's Hajj account, she is quite attentive to the poor pilgrims on her ship, and she goes down to into the from her first class cabin into the kind of bowels of the ship. And she particularly comments there actually on veiling practices and how these women are, because of purdah restrictions, she's very outspoken about purdah restrictions. And she says, they're like veiled upon veil. They're wearing veils, and then they're surrounded in curtains, and then they're stuck in the bottom of the ship and all of this. So she's just kind of obviously aware of the specific concerns of these poor pilgrims, but still quite accepting of the fact that she gets one type of food, and these very fine distinctions. That's what I wanted to sort of draw out in terms of what the different pilgrims are eating above the ship, and the kind of recognition that is, I guess, acceptable, I suppose. So I think in some of them, particularly those, I tried to sort of suggest this, those that are sort of looking for a more kind of pan-Islamic ideal, they speak a lot about just the sort of things you're saying about everybody coming together and the sharing of food and eating together and this, that, and the other. But when we can gain insight through their writings into what they do, actually, there's far more distinctions drawn. I hope that answers your question now. I see there was.
I think we've got one final question, and then we'll have to.
Yeah.
So, do these? Sorry, from Neha Vermani. Do these female travelers have?
Lovely to see you, Neha. Neha's soon to join us at Sheffield, which is wonderful. Okay. No, Neha, there's no mention here of curry powders. These authors talk about. They don't talk about curry, they talk about gravies. They talk about going to particular restaurants. I know Begum Inam Habibullah, for instance, she describes how her sons, and this kind of goes back to your first question, Panikos, her sons are like desperate to have Indian food, and they say, oh, we found this great restaurant where we can gain Indian food. You must come with us, mother, and we will have this. And the gravy is so good. That's how they sort of describe it. And of course, typically for Begum Habibullah, her response is, my sons said it was going to be so wonderful. In fact, the food was terrible. So yeah, there's no kind of explicit reference to curry, but yeah, this kind of idea of these English-made Indian dishes, which are not living up to expectation, I suppose. Yeah, I hope that's helpful, Neha.
Okay, thanks very much. So, again, for answering all those quite complex questions. Thanks to the audience, and thanks again to Siobhan. It was a really fascinating paper. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, and I'm sorry for the for the technical problems in the middle. Thank you so much to everyone for your questions.
Thank you very much. Really enjoyable. Thanks for everyone who stayed with us through the small technical glitch. It was worth staying for the second half. Great questions, everyone. And we'll see you again next month. Thank you, Siobhan. That was really excellent. Really, really good.
Excellent. Thank you so much for having me today.
I almost feel sorry for the English with their criticised grub. If somebody works on the Irish, there is a migration of bad food as well, but we can go there another time.
On that note, I'm off to have my fish and chips.
Okay, Panikos. Thank you, Siobhan. Thank you so much.
See you later. Bye.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you again,
Bye-bye.
Thanks for everything, Myra. Cheers. Bye. Stay
no
well.
worries. Thank you.